So now I want to turn to the real world, and in particular things that we can observe in language production, speech errors. Because it turns out that the idea that a comprehender would infer error processes as underlying part of what they get into the language comprehension system is amply motivated by the fact that speech is not a perfect production system. I'll start with a couple of examples from a very colorful contemporary political figure, Sarah Palin. She was probably even more famous about a decade ago than she is now. Sarah Palin rose to national prominence in 2008 when she became the vice presidential nominee for the Republican Party for the US presidential campaign. And in September 2008, she gave a very famous interview where she said, "I'm not going to solely blame all of man's activities on changes in climate." Now, I want you to take a moment to look at that sentence, think about what it means, and think about its structure. And if you're like me, it was immediately obvious what it meant. And what it meant is not exactly consistent with the structure that it had. In fact, actually, you would have to exchange the positions of two noun phrases in order to get the interpretation that I think that we all get for this. And she didn't do this just once. She actually did a number of times. So a few days later, she was debating Joe Biden in the vice presidential debate. And she said, "I'm not one to attribute every activity of man to climate change." Once again, easy to understand, actually not a literal interpretation. You'd have to do as exchange. Notably, simple insertions and deletions are not going to get us there in accounting for how easily we interpret this sentence to be what we think Palin wants to mean, rather than what she actually literally says. We can also look, so for the last really nearly 50 years now, there's been a rich range of work in psycholinguistics on looking at speech errors. This has actually been most extensively developed historically at the level of the phoneme. So there's a rich typology of these speech errors. So for example, people commit anticipatory errors. So John dropped his cup of coffee instead of John dropped his cup of coffee. In this case, the sound f was not just produced in the place where it was supposed to be, but it seems to have been anticipatorily substituted in instead of the sound p. Reek long race is another example of an anticipatory usage of a R instead of what. There is the opposite direction, perseveration. So in a case where the context made clear that the speaker wanted to say John gave the boy something, the speaker said John gave the boy. Or Spanish speaking people. Perseveration, we're not exactly sure which of the P's it came from, but it definitely substituted in for a K. And there are also exchanges at the phoneme level. So for example, when somebody wanted to say keep a tape, they said keep a cape. The nipper is zero instead of the zipper is narrow. And this even happens at the level of morphology. For example, fancy getting your model renosed instead of your nose remodeled. Back in these days, there were no large electronic data sets, and what people would do is they would actually just keep journals. So psycholinguists kept journals of these features and just excitedly write them down when they heard them and do an analysis. So actually the earliest papers from Ping Garrett, these classic papers on speech errors, are really highly anecdotal. It's very difficult to study speech errors at the sentence level in language production, but I will say that when I started getting into this, I had in the back of my mind, since I was probably in high school, I knew that there was a speech error that I made fairly often that nobody ever noticed, except for me after the fact. So this is an example of it. This is a problem that I need to talk about Joe with. You probably, unless you pay close attention, you might not even notice that there's an error in this sentence. In particular, the interpretation of the sentence that I surely mean when I say this is one that will be literally consistent with an exchange of the two prepositions. So the underlying form should be, this is a problem that I need to talk with Joe about, or this is a problem that I need to talk about with Joe. But these are things that really fly under the cognitive radar, and we don't really notice them. So I've noticed this for many years. Nobody ever notices me make it. And once again, this is something that's extraordinarily unlikely under an insertions deletions noise model. There has to be a minimum of 2 insertions or an insertion and a deletion. But it would be reasonably likely if a word exchange model were included, so if word exchanges are admitted. So in work with Tel Poppels a number of years ago, we actually tried to use these multiple prepositional phrase cases, both after the main verb, to study this. So we did something very similar to the Gibson et al. 2013 paradigm. So the plausible versions of the sentence were like, the package fell from the table to the floor, or the package fell to the floor from the table. The first of these versions I'll call it canonical, because the order of the prepositional phrases is one that's more syntactically common. It's more common in a verb phrase to have from before to than to before from. And then the latter two are implausible versions. The package fell from the floor to the table. The package fell to the table from the floor. And if you're like me, I look at these sentences and I still have a hard time noticing that there's something wrong with them. So we ask things like, did something fall to the floor? And a literal answer for the plausible versions would be yes. A literal answer to the implausible versions would be no. But if people incorrectly answer yes, then we know that they're giving a non-literal answer, and it's evidence of noisy channel interpretation. And it turns out that this happens reasonably often. So the three of these, the upper left and the two bottom ones, are ones that you've seen before. The active passive, which we have a very low error rate for, transitive and transitive, which we have a relatively high error rate for, and then the benefactors, which we have an extremely high error rate for. And the prepositional phrase exchanges, for the implausible conditions, we have quite a few non-literal interpretations. So the raw fact here is that actually this, once again, this can only be explained really easily under an exchange model. It would be very hard to explain this under an insertion and deletion model without exchanges. So this creates a bit of a mystery. Why do the active passives, which also, if any kinds of exchange, were okay in the comprehender's noise model, why do we not see a lot of misinterpretations of implausible actives and passives? But we see a lot of misinterpretations, non-literal interpretations of implausible prepositional phrase combinations. And then there's another wrinkle in the empirical tapestry, which is the following. So going back to this, the Shannon noise model picture, one thing that you might notice is that, well, if we're actually interested in exploring this, although we've tried to probe relatively indirectly what the comprehender interpretations are by asking questions that help us get at M, another thing we might do is we might just ask people more directly, what do you think the speaker meant to say? What was the intended you? Now, from a formal point of view, what this implies is that there's a formal discrepancy between what we're going to now call you the intended utterance, what the speaker meant to say. And that suggests that there's a sort of actual utterance, we'll call it U prime, which is the thing that the speaker actually said. Or perhaps if we're getting a transcript of what the speaker said, then it's what was in the transcript, for example, which might be discrepant from what the speaker actually said. And this doesn't really change anything qualitative here. This just suggests that there is some distance in terms of the opportunity for noise to intervene between the intended utterance and the actual utterance. But formally, there's no qualitative difference between that and anything else in the noisy channel model. So that's perfectly fair game. So Riskin et al. 2018 did an experiment that had a cover story where they used the Gibson et al. Type sentences, and they had participants read transcriptions of speech that they said, well, these transcriptions might have errors, and we'd like you to retype the sentences and make appropriate edits if you think that the speaker might have meant something else. So as two examples, one of the transcription sentences was the ball kicked the girl that you saw before, and participants might write, for example, the ball kicked the girl, and the researchers would annotated this, since it's just a verbatim retyping, as there was no error. There was no error that was inferred to have occurred in the transcription process. If the participant wrote the girl kicked the ball, then the annotation would be that there's an inference that an exchange occurred, an exchange error in the transcription process occurred. Or the ball was kicked by the girl. That would imply that the participant has inferred that there was a deletion of material, that the two words were missing. The deleted material was that was and by were left out, and so what was left in the transcript was the ball kicked the girl. Here's another example. The judge gave the athlete to the prize. And these examples, for example, if the participant wrote the judge gave the athlete the prize, it would have been a hypothesized insertion. The insertion material got inserted to the transcript. The judge gave the athlete a prize. Likewise, it doesn't have to be verbatim except for the insertion. So this would also be annotated as insertion. Or the judge gave the prize to the athlete. That would be annotated as an exchange. So let's see what the results are for these cases. So the three facets of this are the types of sentences that were given as transcript sentences. We had the deletion cases, like the correct politicians profited the bribes. The hypothesized deletion would most plausibly be from, between profited and the. Insertion cases like the actor handed the director to the script, where the insertion would be probably the word to, and exchanges like simple active passives like the bull broke the grandfather. And I want you to notice something here, which is that, so first of all, that it is the case that in the condition where comprehenders were expected to hypothesize deletions, the most common thing to have hypothesized were deletions, and in the condition where the comprehender was expected to hypothesize insertions, that insertions were hypothesized quite often. And another thing you'll notice is that deletions are hypothesized more often than insertions. Once again, that is consistent with the prediction of the noisy channel theory. But the wrinkle here is that the most often thing to have been hypothesized at all is exchanges. This bar is higher than anything else. And in fact, even in the insertions condition, exchanges are hypothesized by the participants more often than exchanges. Or more exchanges are hypothesized by the participant more often than insertions. And so there's actually still a wrinkle in these data, which is that in the Gibson et al. 2013 study, those data are replicated, there seems to be a very strong dispreference for interpretations that would require conjecturing that there was an exchange error. However, in the other studies, in the Poppels et al. Study, we have evidence for inference of exchanges. And in the Riskin et al. Study, we also have evidence of inferences of exchanges. And this is actually relatively direct evidence of like, well, if you're going to say, write down what you think the speaker said or intended to say, you would exchange two words. And so we actually have, to summarize this body of empirical data, we have an interesting picture. And I'll be clear that this is still an open research area, and so we don't really fully understand all of the details. But broadly speaking, then we have this noisy channel framework, which we developed in the last class. And here we have applied it to global interpretations. And it naturally offers an investigation of global interpretations, not just incremental processing. And with global interpretations, what we can do is we can probe meanings that people seem to be likely to be getting. And actually, these non-literal interpretations can be extremely frequent with the right stimuli. In fact, they were overwhelmingly more likely than literal interpretations for the benefactive double object cases. There are also various cases of fine-grained consistency between Bayesian principles of trade-off between prior and likelihood, or basically the noisy channel framework, and the empirical data. For example, deletions are easier to infer than insertions. When you increase the rate of grammatical errors in the environment, you get more non-literal inferences. Conversely, when you increase the rate of implausible sentences in the environment, you get fewer non-literal inferences. But we still have this wrinkle, which is we don't fully understand the status of exchange errors in the noise model. That remains a mystery. And this is an active, ongoing research area. Hopefully, it provides a pretty strong range of evidence that there's a lot to speak for the noisy channel theory for this range of global interpretation preferences, but there's still more that remains to be worked out, and that is the subject of future research.